Welcome back. Well, we've learned a little bit about page structure and some basic design elements. So now I want to get into what it actually looks like and what kinds of rules you need to follow when you actually put a spread together. So one of the things that I want you to look at with this graduation spread is the variety of the photos. Photo variety really helps to tell every part of the story. So you want to try to think about that as you select the photos that actually go on your spreads. A few things to consider. You guys see this gray line that's running down the center. Remember what that's called, that's your gutter. So you have to kind of keep in mind that you're going to lose some of that photo space. Remember I talked about you don't want to have gutter face in your picture? If we had centered our subject of this photo in the middle of the picture, he would have gutter face. So you see by putting him just offset, that really helps with the visual variety. It also helps with creating what we call rule of thirds in a photograph. So rule of thirds occurs if you would put like just a visual tic-tac-toe board. Just pretend there's this tic-tac-toe board on top of this picture. The center of visual interest in a photo, you want to have it one of the intersecting points of that tic-tac-toe board. So we see our center of visual interest is here. This is where one of the intersecting points of that tic-tac-toe board would be. So we not only have our picture of our celebrating graduate here, we have graduates throwing caps here, we have a graduate waving to her family, we have two friends talking excitedly, we have the hugs going on, and we have the girl getting her diploma and getting a hug there as well. So we have some different pieces to the story that are being told. Those are things you guys want to keep in mind as you create your spreads. Notice that this is still like a very traditional yearbook and a very traditional spread. All the elements are placed so that they're single pica apart. Those are our standard spacing for journalism. Here and here we have a little bit greater space to separate the story and the captions. We call that a rail, and I'll talk about rail when we get into a little bit more to advanced design. But other than that, everything really has that tight one pica standard spacing. Again, it's pretty traditional. So how do you amp that up? How do you make things a little bit more visually exciting? So let's see if I'm going to get this to switch. There we go. So one thing to do is you want to try to play with your headline a little bit. This one has a verbal visual connection now just by making the rad all caps. We've got kind of a radical, excited movement here by our center of visual interest in our picture. And seniors talk the talk, now they've walked the walk. That headline, he's walking the walk, right? So we got that verbal visual connection. That's one way to start to make this come a little bit more to life. Gonna keep adding layers here as we go through. So that's not the only thing to do though. So one other suggestion is that you can echo that dominant color from the photo in your headline and caption leads ins and in your stories drop cap. So just to add some interest, we're adding some color. You don't want to use color. When you use color, you want to use color purposefully. So you want to select colors that are good colors that go with the spread. Sometimes you'll have theme colors or a theme color palette. So you want to choose colors that will work well for your school if you have a color palette. You know you're going to have a lot of school colors, so somewhere in that color palette you should have a school color. You may have other colors. You may use a single color on a spread. You may use more than one color on a spread. We'll talk more about color in a little bit later. But that is one thing you can do to add visual entry points. But look at all the other things that they've done on this spread now as they've tried to add some visual interest to it. You can bleed the cap photo so that the caps fly up and off the page. So see how, remember when I talked about you don't want to move anything into the, up to the trim line or into the margin unless you want to risk it getting cut off in the last presentation, or maybe even the first presentation. So that's what you're seeing here. This photo is bleeding off the top, but that's okay. It gives that sense of motion. The caps are flying up, everything's flying up. It's purposeful bleeding of the photo to give that extra height, to give that extra action. So that's one way to add some visual interest. We have blue entry points on our caption lead-ins. We have a pull quote we've added here. So rather than having just a caption to go with this photo, they've added an additional interesting pull quote to it. Sorry about that. Okay, so they've also used a combination of serif and sans serif types to give some visual effect to their spread. That is one thing you can do. You can use different fonts, faces within the same font family, so that maybe you have a bold or an extra bold or a thin or an italic. So adding those purposefully, not randomly. You need to make some decisions as a staff or as editors about how that's going to work. But having a pattern for that, having purpose for that, those are other things you can do to add visual interest to your spread. So it's still relatively traditional at this point. You can think about other things that you may want to do as well, though. Let's see. Okay, that's the same. Let me get to one more. Okay, so if you don't like traditional copy, you can think about, if you think, oh, nobody's going to read that story. You know, you guys are a quick read generation. You get your information in very fast, small chunks typically. So this gives you an idea of how you could do that. So in this case, instead of having one traditional story, they've split this into 4 different little mini stories. Each of them is going to have a little mini subhead and a pull quote that goes along with it. And these would be varied information from different graduates if you followed that type of a design. So that would add another level or another option for how you can add interest to your story. Again, this is still relatively traditional. We're going to get into modular design next, but it's always good to know the basics. The one other thing that I didn't really talk about is having your photos having the action move toward the center. You want to try not to have the people on your spreads facing off the page. While this girl in the red cap and gown is looking off the page, she's actually looking at this other girl who's looking back at her, so that kind of gives that reflection back into the spread. That's okay. What happens when you have your pictures so that they're facing off the page is your reader's eye wants to move off the page. So that's another good tip as you're selecting your photos. Try to select and place photos so that the action of them or the vision of them, the eye flow of them, is moving toward the center of your spread, back to the content, so that your reader's not looking off. Again, when you look at this, remember that I talked before about the eye line. So just a little review here. We still have our eye line. Everything on your spread, all of your photos are either sitting on the eye line, hanging from the eye line. Your design builds out from that XY axis, if you guys remember that. We keep our text and our white space or negative space to the outside of the spread. All those things are great tips, things to remember as you create your designs. All right, time for another little comprehension check.